century design used to submerge and maintain African Americans and communities of color in a second-class status. African Americans and communities of color in a second-class status. And according to Michigan NAACP, or the Center for Educational Performance and Information, Michigan's low test scores are epidemic, where only 29.6% of Michigan students are proficient on the Michigan Student Test of Educational Progress, or what we call MSTEP. And when we break this down by race, it only gets worse. 38.2% of our white children are proficient in all subjects, where 19.6% of our Latino students are proficient, and only 10.4% of our African American students are proficient. So I argue that if test scores are the indicator of a healthy educational system, then we should be concerned with an entirely infected system where most Michigan children, especially those of color, are purposefully being destined for failure. And I want you to know, because I'm going to give some calls to action, but the NAACP in 1976 passed a resolution which called for NAACP units to provide consumer advocacy regarding the use and misuse of tests. It called for those of us as NAACP freedom fighters to also advise parents of their legal rights in the testing of their children. And this is yet our call to action. So as we talk about school charters, and I know my colleagues up here will talk more, but as we talk about school charters, and mainly for-profit charters in Michigan have proliferated at a rate higher than any other state. Even as our student population has declined in Michigan, where 10 years ago, Michigan had a population of 1.6 million and declined to 1.5 million for the 2017-2018 school year. However, Michigan went from 12 charter schools 12 charter school districts in 1994-95 school year to a peak of 300 in the 2014-2015 school year. Now we have about 293. But we know that the constant cycle of charter schools opening and closing every year is brutal for families, forcing students to frequently change schools, disrupting their education, causing a drain on educational resources of public education system. And in 2016, the NAACP National Convention delegates passed and the National Board affirmed a resolution calling for the moratorium on the expansion of charter schools. And this is yet our call to action. We are all witnessing, even those of you who are here in Michigan and outside of Michigan, we're all witnessing the federal government policies that speed up the school-to-prison pipeline or aim to dismantle public education. Whether it's Betsy DeVos, who unfortunately is from Michigan, failed attempt at rolling back civil rights protections for Black students, disciplined disproportionately, or whether it was Donald Trump's White House calling for the Department of Education to be merged with the Department of Labor. And what is our call to action here? We must continue to fight any efforts that remove protections to prevent our children of color, especially our African American young men, from being disproportionately suspended and expelled. We have to be vigilant to protect our children from programs of the past that sound promising, but intended to subject our children to be laborers, and cheap laborers at that. And then as we talk about our state of emergency as it relates to teacher retention and recruitment, and of course the loss is greater for our African American teachers. Researchers show, and I don't need to tell you in this room, but research shows that African American primary school students matched in the same race, teachers perform better on standardized tests, and it reduces their probability of dropping out of high school. And this is especially true for our boys and those who are most economically disadvantaged. But with millions of dollars cut from public education and increased use of standardized tests, and more testing means more pressure on teachers, teachers losing their academic freedom, all with less pay, and the expectation to be the people who stock the supplies in the classroom. The harsher penalties for underperforming schools create yet another deterrent to people considering a teaching career. Educators walking out of at record numbers, and we have fewer substitutes. There are fewer students also enrolling in colleges of education. So we have a call to action, and that is to continue, my fellow brothers and sisters of the NAACP and freedom fighters, but to continue to advocate for the employment of more African American teachers and making sure that the environments that they work in, both physically and socially, are conducive to their retention. And then let's look at school funding. And again, I know my colleagues will get into this more in a few moments. But in January 2018, a bipartisan group of educators and business people who found that our schools are inadequately funded. Of course, we're not surprised. Where the base cost here in Michigan to educate a regular student in K-12 grades should be $9,590 per pupil. This figure did not include transportation, food service, or capital costs. The studies show that schools should be funded 35% more for students who come from poverty, 70% more for students with mild special education needs, and 115% more for students with moderate special education needs in order for them to be successful. In January 2019, Michigan State University released a report that shows that in the past 25 years, Michigan has been seeing the lowest growth in K-12 education spending of any state in the nation. So while funding is said to have increased since 2011, when the Snyder administration assumed office, the added money is not ending up in the classroom. Part of it, a whole $4.5 billion. That's a B at the end of that. A whole $4.5 billion over the past 8 years is paying back money that was intended for education, but raided from the general fund to give to the business sector. And I commend Governor Whitmer for proposing a budget that will make the biggest investment in public schools operation in a generation of kids, including more than $22 million for Detroit public schools. Don't say anything, Dr. Vitti. However, we have to do more. A May 2019 article in Crain's Detroit Business points out that Detroit Public Schools has $500 billion in capital construction needs. The article also cites my fellow colleague here, Dr. Vitti, stating that unless DPSCD can raise these funds, the potential for improvement in the district has reached a ceiling. In a report, Michigan Finance at the Crossroads, authors discuss the impact of the state relying on local property taxes for the repair and building of public school facilities, while at the same time, the state is depleting the property taxes available to African American districts like Detroit. In the Crain's article, it also notes that public funding accounted for $324 million of the $863 million in cost to build the new Little Caesars Arena. Did you all see it? It's beautiful, but it came from our babies. And that's here in downtown Detroit. The bonds being issued to cover the public financing are to be paid for out of the tax capture of property tax funds that otherwise would be available to fund Detroit schools, infrastructure repairs. Benton Harbor, and you all may have been hearing about what's going on in Benton Harbor. It's again in the news today. But Benton Harbor, which like Detroit is a predominantly African American city, also cannot afford to face the potential closing of cannot afford to pay the debt service owed by the school district and continues to face the potential closing of its high school because of it. The Benton Harbor School District was deprived of needed tax revenue to pay the debt by the creation of a tax increment authority, which is slated to capture $125 million in sorely needed property tax revenue, which could be used for the school district. And this brings me to another subject, and this is before I close. And that is the Detroit Right to Literacy case, in which 7 students from Detroit, Gary B., Jesse K., Christopher R., Isaiah, Esmeralda, Paul, Jamie, filed a lawsuit in 2016 against the state of Michigan, claiming Black schools prevented them from learning to read. And this is owed to decades of inequitable funding and disastrous state takeover education programs, which are experiments. The students argue that literacy in the US is a constitutional right. The case is being referred to by many as the modern day Brown v. Board of Education, and it could have national implication. In July of 2018, US District Judge Stephen Murphy in Detroit dismissed the case, granting the request from then Attorney General Bill Schuette. In July of 2018, the attorneys representing the students, however, filed an appeal in the US Court of Appeals. So in my official capacity as a member of the State Board of Education, I am named as a defendant, along with my 7 fellow board members, the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, and Governor Whitmer. In July of 2018, as candidate, it was Gretchen Whitmer, said that she too believed that the US Constitution does include a right to literacy. But in pleadings filed on May 24th of this year, her statements in the state of Michigan sidestepped the question and urged the US Court of Appeals to dismiss a lawsuit aimed at establishing that right. As a member of the State Board of Education, elected by the people, as a member of this long-standing group of freedom fighters, I stand firm on my belief that anything short of Governor Whitmer and state education officials completely separating themselves from former Attorney General Bill Schuette's argument and taking responsibility for our children of color being granted the equal right to critical learning conditions that are afforded to students in other school districts is simply unacceptable. We know that state emergency management of the Detroit district has robbed Detroit children of the basic right to literacy, a fundamental right, which I believe would be determined to be guaranteed by the US Constitution, as well as other constitutional rights which require literacy skills. On May of 28th of 2018, I reviewed an appeal brief filed by the Michigan Attorney General on behalf of the governor and the defendants, and I sent a correspondence to the Michigan Attorney General's office that I did not support the legal position taken by the Counsel for Attorney General in the appealing brief filed on behalf of the state defendant on May 24th. And then on June 7th, our current Attorney General, Dana Nessel, in what is being said to be unprecedented, too stepped out and filed on behalf of the Detroit students' side in the literacy case, which was a wonderful thing. After a lot of back and forth with the AG's office, I was informed that I would be required to find legal representation of my own in order to take a legal position, to stand with and for the students of Detroit. And of course, I did just that. I secured my own legal representation to guide me through the appealing process in this case, and on last Friday, on July 19th, my attorneys filed requesting a leave from the court to file a brief to specifically address the issues of Michigan school finance and its impact on the constitutionality of the education provided to the students of Detroit schools. So as a very proud member of the NAACP, as an elected official who represents the people, I stand tall. I stand firm for our children. I am dogged and I am determined to use my position to gut out the spoils of racism, to dismantle policies, practices, and acts that further perpetuate discrimination and inequality. I will not cease in the fight to assure the well-being and equitable and adequate education for all Michigan children. And that's why I elected to stand unwavering with the plaintiff appellants. And again, that's Gary B., Jesse, Christopher, Isaiah, Esmeralda, Paul, and Jamie. And I know Dr. V probably knows these children. I have chosen to be on the right side of history. So finally, in closing, I submit to you our final call to action. and that is, as the largest and longest standing civil rights organization, let us remember that we have to be bold and courageous, just like our NAACP freedom-fighting brothers and sisters were 110 years ago. Let us be mindful that we must call out and call on our elected officials to stand up for our children, just as our NAACP freedom-fighting brothers and sisters did 65 years ago. Let us not forget that we are the defenders and the protectors and the wardens of our children's educational equality of rights. And we must be the ones that guard their health and well-being. My brothers and sisters, let us not grow weary in the fight. Thank you.